So just as a note, the name was a little bounced around on the program, so it's a long name. It's Multiethnic Advocates for Cultural Competence. So it's a mouthful, so we just call it MACC, M-A-C-C for short. But today I'm going to talk to you guys about the class standards and what it means to be culturally and linguistically appropriate, why that matters, and we can have a discussion around kind of how that works with the work that you do. Sound good? Yeah. Okay. So I won't bore you with what we do and the mission and the vision, but I have to do that, right? All this information is on our website. Also, shameless plug, we have a conference next week, actually, here in Columbus. Well, actually, technically in Gahanna. So more information about that is also on the website. But whenever we do presentations talking about cultural competence, we always like to start in the beginning with talking about terms that we've all heard before, but there's so many different interpretations for what they mean. And why that's important is because when we talk about creating policies or changing programs, if we all have a different definition for what diversity, for example, means, that's going to look a little different across the board. And what we really try to do is make sure that we're on the same page. Specifically in our state in Ohio, we are a statewide organization, and so we want to make sure that in all corners of the state, knowing how diverse the state is, but still hoping that everybody's kind of starting on the same page. So in 2010, MACC worked with state departments to actually craft a definition of cultural competence for that very reason that I just mentioned. And it's our definition, so we hope that this is what you're using in your work when you're talking about cultural competence as a baseline for what we mean with this work. And the really important piece to remember here is a continuous learning process. So there's no end point. There can be a starting point, but there's no end point. There's no time where we stop being educated about being culturally competent. We stop being educated about the folks in our communities. There's no end point. And that can sometimes feel a little bit heavy or maybe demoralizing because it's like, oh, we're just always doing this. It's never going to stop. But that's the commitment to the work. So it really starts with an individual commitment to caring about making sure that we're servicing folks in the most appropriate way. Linguistic competence, and the other thing about any of the definitions that we talk about, there's not necessarily one baseline correct definition. There's so many, again, interpretations, and so this is just one. This comes from Georgetown University, actually has a national center for cultural competence at their university is housed there, and they worked to craft this definition about linguistic competence. But it essentially just talks about being able to respond to the linguistic needs of the folks that are being serviced. And below are some examples of what that would look like. Again, not an exhaustive list. But the important thing about linguistic competence is a lot of that is federally mandated. So we're required by the federal government to offer language assistance that's appropriate for the folks that are being serviced, which can be difficult, especially when we'll talk about our changing demographics and languages that we've never encountered or experienced or are not familiar with, and the challenges that we face trying to provide interpretation services for those communities. Now we're going to get into somewhere I want you to kind of help me with those because, again, these are definitions that we hear and see all the time, but there's so many different interpretations. We want to talk about why they're different and what that means. Race has often been referred to, I'm just going to take this off, it's not even working, but often referred to biology, which we know is not factually correct, right? Folks from different racial categories can have similar biology than folks in the same racial category oftentimes. So we want to move away from this idea that it's biological, but again, especially here in the United States, we focused on skin color as the biggest marker for placing folks in those categories. So these are the categories that are identified by the federal government as it relates to race. The difference with ethnicity, I think you mentioned like geography, right? So the only ethnic category that is recognized by the federal government is Latino Hispanic. And for that reason, because it can't be pinpointed into one country. But these categories are kind of based on folks residing in the United States, right? So, African Americans, descendants of Africans that are in the United States, and so that's kind of helpful to look at that. We talk about bias overall, but when we talk about implicit bias, is that this individual, I'm not aware of my bias. Is that we are holding, not only are people biased, frame this conversation, it's certainly not a finger-pointing conversation, right? We're all innately as human beings biased. carry a level of implicit bias. So, for example, I could say I'm really pro-environment, I want to save the animals, for example, but maybe subconsciously I hold a view that's very contradictory towards that. Or I hold a view of people who do support those causes in a very negative and not positive frame of reference. Does that make sense? Some of it is natural, right? We, just based on our own nature, we have different levels of comfort. You have a comfort zone. The point is that we have to kind of do check-ins with ourselves to see if that's getting kind of out of hand, right? See if it's really impacting some folks more than it is others. Going back to that first paragraph, the implicit bias is important to understand because even though you're consciously rejecting, you're consciously supporting something but unconsciously holding a bias, that particular group or cause or what have you can maybe still feel that because it manifests itself in our body language. So like I'm 5'2". If I maybe have an unconscious bias against folks that are 6'7" and above, I think I'm just talking to them like I talk to everyone else, like, hey, how was your day? But really I'm kind of like, hey, how was your day? Hey. Not really looking at them, just very closed in to myself. People can feel when you're uncomfortable, so everyone that's 6'7" and above, they see how I interact with them as being extremely different to the way I interact with everybody else. But I would never, I would never be conscious enough to admit that I have that bias. That's why it's so important to try to dig at that. It's about your level of awareness. That when somebody maybe points it out to you that you have a pattern of interacting with folks that are that maybe is a bias, and you start to become more aware of that, about that's different, right? And if you still continue to act in a way that is negative towards those folks, then you're explicitly expressing that. You do have an awareness of it, but you still are not changing any of the behaviors of your mindset, and so that's just kind of an explicit bias that you're expressing. Right? We see this a lot. Maybe folks that, for example, we talk about the LGBTQ community, right? Folks that say, I'm an ally, I'm an ally, but maybe subconsciously hold really negative viewpoints and beliefs about folks that are actually in that group, right? So it's important to understand that, but again, it's not finger pointing because we do all hold some level, but when it becomes so pervasive that, again, it's impacting groups of people that you're interacting with negatively and they feel that, that's when we need to do some check-ins. No, it's okay. I'm not going to say any of it. We're saying that the bias is more concerning, manifesting those things. And so, for example, I think Harvard a couple years ago created some implicit association tests that are online. You can kind of click through those. There's all different categories around disability, race, ethnicity, I think gender. There really are so many different categories to try, of course this is not a foolproof system, to try to get you to think about possibly a bias that you may hold against a community. And what you'll be really surprised is oftentimes folks take those tests and they have a bias, like, for example, I may have a bias against women, right? You may have a bias against a community that you actually identify with, which is really surprising. So I will forewarn you, if you do take that, I don't want you to go into a panic and think, I'm so biased, because sometimes what that is overcompensate, right? Now if I'm concerned, bias, compensating, and color and trying to be their, they can also sense that, also sense whether your interaction is genuine, whether it's comfortable or not. So we don't want to compensate based on any kind of findings that you may feel about yourself. But these are just important to know.
Know what is bias and just what is a preference?
Mm-hmm. Be the difference.
A lot of let's say women in being bosses, or women, let's say pastoring. Maybe you have a bias or a preference in wanting to hear men, or to be men in bosses or whatever. Is that a bias?
So when would your preference become a bias? What do you think would be that line that differentiates? What do you guys think? Because again, we all have preferences. He said, for example, against female pastors or females in leadership positions. And she was saying, what changes it from just a preference to an actual bias that you hold? What would be the difference there, do you think? The intensity of it? Mm-hmm. The negative viewpoint, because I can have a preference, but if it's based on something negative. If my preference is based on the fact that I truly believe that females cannot, preach the word to the same capacity as a man, or that females are not efficient in leadership roles the same way as men, that is a bias. Does that make sense? It has to be backed up by that negative perception of that group. So you have the perception of one over of another. That's what we mean by a bias. It's not just about preference. But again, this is a kind of a spectrum, a continuum. So you have a preference, bias, leading into stereotyping, leading into, if there's a kind of a continuum there. But unfortunately, I think in the conversation, all these pieces get lost because there is a lot of finger pointing. But it's really important to understand what we mean by these concepts. And it's important to understand that we are all guilty of it at some point in our lives. Everything is constantly changing, right? Our communities are constantly changing. Certain world events are changing. September 11th was recently happened. Think about all the things that changed. All of our perceptions about different communities that just instantly shifted.
It just came out of it. Actually changed.
Yeah, because that's a part of, culture is what we're talking about. So if I move to a different state, I'm going to pick up some of the pieces from the folks in that state versus where I was. All of that is going to change my kind of world perspective. Students, at very young ages will start to kind of bring some of the stuff that they're hearing at home to the classroom and the way they interact with their classmates now, I experienced that when I was younger. So again, we talked about culture. Again, there's not a necessary standard definition for culture, and this is not an exhaustive list for, what is a culture, but just thinking. Our age is a huge one, right? We have a lot of conversations about generations, baby boomers, Gen Xers, the bad word millennials. That's what they're calling the younger digital natives, Generation Z, Alpha is after them. Think about the differences between an alpha and a baby boomer. Think about how truly vast life experience differences we have there. So just think about that in the workplace. Think about that in the school setting. Think about that in any setting. How hard that is, even just for millennials and baby boomers, and have conversations where they kind of, appreciate one another's point of view. So just thinking about that, even talking about from a global perspective, how do the cultural difference, what does that mean? What does that mean for you as maybe a world traveler? If you're going to other places and you're telling them where you're from and you're not understanding maybe how they're reacting to you, or why the response is what it is, it's important to understand that folks build up stereotypes and biases, about you on a national level. Talk about nationalism is a really big thing as well. Okay, why does this matter? Let's play. So we can all just get along. I know, right? That's awesome. It's not about insisting on changing anyone's perceptions. Because we're all human beings, and the beauty of our country is that we're supposed to be free to feel how we feel. Hopefully that doesn't negatively impact someone else, but we're not here to change your perception. I think sometimes we just spend so much time focusing on our world perspective and our journey and our challenges, and maybe trying to be the squeakiest wheel, right? On a maybe on the national scale, we talk about politics. Like, wait, look at me. We need the attention, we need the programming, we need the services. That we get so or step out of it. When you do talk about parents who have migrated or immigrated to this country and their children, right, are adapting to maybe some more Western ideals or perspectives, and there's a conflict that happens a lot of times within that household and that family dynamic, right, of the children maybe rejecting some of their historical cultural perspectives and adapting to some of the ones that are more representative of where they currently live and the environment that they're currently in. How do you navigate that? A lot of the concepts that we may have culturally don't exist especially when we talk about, health and really mental health. It's not about agreeing with it. We're just saying accept it, because you're not going to change their perception. Not only do we accept, but that's what you teach others, right? In terms of conflict resolution, these are conflict resolution tactics as well, is to get folks to say that I am respecting where you are and your viewpoint with each side, age-old act of just agreeing to disagree and moving forward. So sometimes you have to walk them through that as well, because they don't understand what that means. We're saying in the next, I'll say 2 to 3 years, all the children in the United States, the majority of the children will be from what we traditionally refer to as minority groups, minority racial and ethnic groups. So over half the children in the United States will be from those populations. There are also some babies have already surpassed that. So children 1 year and younger in the United States, the majority of them are from minority groups. And then the projection is that by 2050, 2060, 2045, there's all kinds of projections. We're going to be a nation where the majority of the population is from minority groups. So how is that going to change and evolve the way that we reference different populations? So it's important to understand that, of course, we know, talking about the language kind of barrier, where English is not the first language in the household, steadily continues to rise, and then foreign-born population. So the foreign-born population in 2014 was 13.1, but you can't always assume that foreign-born means English is not the first language. It's important to remember that too. So National Geographic put out predictions for what the average American will look like. Minority nation. Has anyone ever seen this? Nobody's ever seen it? Nobody? Oh, I was going to say, that's so surprising. At least we have usually one or two people. You know what it makes me think? Racially ambiguous, right?
Which is what already.
Kind of, we think about the concept of race, we do that, just in an interaction. When I'm talking to you, I'm subconsciously in my mind deciding what groups to put you in, like female, what group. I'm doing that immediately. The problem and the challenge is that, we really should be letting folks self-identify. And when they start self-identifying, then the list becomes longer, or there's a really long other category. And so it can get really complicated, and there's no quick answer. I know on not this year's, we'll have categories that never had, because they had to adjust from the previous one, because the change has been so significant that they are going to try to now capture information in a way that they didn't do in years past. We have a level of comfort. It's really uncomfortable for a lot of people to look at that picture, to have a lot of these conversations. And we do need to know. People have gotten really frustrated with me, what are you? I'm like, a human being! It's being mindful about what our comfort level is and not people. To self-identify ways that make us comfortable.
To me, they'll say, well, you don't look black. That's a compliment.
Right.
White. A compliment. Mm-hmm. And to say I don't look black is such an insult. I just want to say to the person, if it's a woman, I want to say, well, you don't look like a woman. I'm saying that to her, and I don't know why they think.
But think about folks that people do say that to them. You don't look like a woman, and right. So this we talk for days and days and days about these great subjects. As you kind of, move throughout the rest of the day in the conference, it's always important to do some kind of action planning about work like this. So what did I learn that I didn't know before? What am I going to do differently? So things that I was trying to go about it a certain way, but I'm going to shift that a little bit. And then what do I still not understand? There are some pieces that you're definitely still going to be missing, and identifying those is really important to the future success of your journey through cultural competence. And there's so many resources out there. MACC is certainly one of those resources, and will continue to be. But I hope that you, again, make this commitment on the individual level as you move forward. So thank you, guys.
Thank you.